Well, welcome. Thank you for joining us for this online pre-concert talk for our program that we've titled From Conflict to Peace, in which we feature two works separated by about 140 years by two luminaries, and much to talk about with these pieces that really with themes of war. The prevailing theme is really peace, a message that's so important even today. But I just want to say thank you to everyone who joined us for our opening concerts this season. From darkness to light, I can't tell you how meaningful it was for us on stage to be with you in the same room, inside in a real live concert hall, making music at this time, music that really speaks to the moment that we all find ourselves. And that is one in which we're all just full of hope for better and brighter days. And it was emotional experience for me, and I know for our artists, and I hope for you, one in which we all felt that hope and sense of better days ahead. And so thank you so much for joining us for that, and we look forward to this next program. I'm joined again here today by our new managing director, Welz Kauffman. And Welz, you've been on the job now 2 months and one concert under your belt. How's it going so far?
Feels pretty great. I had a sense that during the rehearsal period and first performances that I would be experiencing as a staff member, that I would feel a sense of calm, more than perhaps one typically does in a new job. But I had no idea how overwhelming that feeling of calm and comfort would be. And in fact, the word that keeps coming to my mind, and when people ask me about how it's going, is that I honestly felt a sense of being at home. And I think part of that was, of course, the performances themselves last weekend, which were great, but also you very generously allowed me to be on stage for a bit. So to be on stage, both to turn pages and to be surrounded by these artists and their artistry, and not only in a performance, but a dress rehearsal and 3 performances, because I think one of the great luxuries of working for a performing arts organization is that those of us that do that get multiple performances of the same program. And there's something very luxurious about that, something so interesting about that, and something that allows one to have an appreciation for the artists in a way that perhaps one shot doesn't quite do in the same way. So all of that was not only quite overwhelming, but I have to say that the closing work on the first program of the season, the Copeland Promise of Living, was particularly relevant for me because I had the great pleasure and honor of working for Robert Shaw, and he and Copeland were quite close. He commissioned Copeland. Mr. Shaw was not an opera guy by any stretch of the imagination. Yeah. Everybody was trying to convince him to be an opera guy, but he resisted. But he loved Promise of Living and felt the hope and the peace that came out of that. And at the last performance, I was thinking, my goodness, here we are about to embark on the second concert program of the season, and there's a work that sets Walt Whitman, and of course it was Mr. Shaw who commissioned one of the greatest settings of Whitman ever, the Lilacs of Paul Hindemith, for the passing of FDR. And it's still a piece that resonates with me deeply. When I was working for Mr. Shaw, he went to Yale to do a 50th anniversary performance of the piece. And that was my first time hearing him do it. But then learning more about composers and Walt Whitman, I had not realized that he is the most often set poet of anyone in the world. And I'd kind of known that because when I was working in Chicago, we did a massive bicentennial celebration of Abraham Lincoln, and you can't do that unless you understand the great scribe of that time. Lots of people wrote about the Civil War and Lincoln, but no one captured it in the way that Whitman did. As a nurse, and when I think about Von Williams, being in the war and being a medic, it kind of connected things in a way that I hadn't expected in learning more about the second work on this marvelous program.
Absolutely, and I want to get into that what is actually my favorite Vaughan Williams work, the Dona Nobis Pacem. But let's set the table first with Haydn's Mass in Time of War. So, near the end of Haydn's career, which was a prolific career, and we often think of Haydn as, the father of the symphony and 104 symphonies and his London symphonies, but his choral works near the end, the creation, the seasons, and those 6 great masses are some of his finest accomplishments, I think. We did one last year in the bubble, the Theresian Mesa, and we do another in this massive time of war, or sometimes known as the Pokken Mesa, Pokken German being drum, or kettle drum, or war drum, if you prefer. This piece has a prominent role for the symphony, in that it's sort of it reflects the ominous threat of Napoleon and his forces closing in, and Austria and Vienna in particular was the sense was palpable. I imagine that this threat was happening, and so it was in that context that Haydn wrote one of his great last great masses. These masses were really to honor the wife of the prince, Esterhazy, and so he wrote these pieces for the name day of the princess, and this one, Mass in Time of War, is a standout to me. It's written in the context of wartime, but it has a real strong message of peace. Of course, we get those words, Dona Nobis Pacem, at the end of a mass as part of the Agnus Dei. And by the way, many composers set these words. The great composers, they're writing symphonies to prove their merit, but they're also writing masses. I mean, even Bach, assembled a mass, a full-blown mass, and as we know, Bernstein wrote a mass. So in the case of Haydn, this was a job requirement, and to write these masses in honor of the princess, and we get this Mass in Time of War. The Agnus Dei starts with this sort of rumble. It's like the distant drums of war, and so you feel that foreboding, and then you get the trumpet fanfares. It's like almost a call to battle, but the message that you're left with at the end is Dona Nobis Pacem, and of course that's the title of the Vaughan Williams piece, and it's not insignificant that we end this concert with those words, Dona Nobis Pacem, but we end the season with those words, Dona Nobis Pacem, in Bach's glorious setting of those words that has just a breadth and a global feel to it that I don't know, just accentuates the need for peace among all, in all time and among all people. And so this program that we've titled From Conflict to Peace it's not just about wanting to envision a world without war. It's so much bigger than that. It's about envisioning a world in which all people have a voice and are heard and honored, and we live in harmony and with respect for one another. So I think the message of this piece and certainly the Vaughan Williams is that.
No question about it. I think not everyone would agree with this necessarily, but of the 3 composers that put the classical style on the map, Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven, Haydn's probably the most underrated.
Oh yeah.
And part of it was because he was so prolific. And so how could you possibly write 104 great symphonies when Beethoven only writes 9 and Mozart 41? Of course, Mozart's life was cut shorter, but there's also this feeling that Haydn is kind of worked out and more about sonata form and theory than it is about emotion. And this piece definitely he just takes all of that away. Yes, the masses at that time were works for hire. But at the same time, it was the end of his life. And he was at the top of his powers, top of his game. And even though we don't know whether we know he didn't put Mass in Time of War on as a title, because he never titled any of his works. The symphonies, whatever they might be, drum roll, toy, whatever, were all given by other people. Nevertheless, I think all that means is that they are even deeper than perhaps when I started coming to Haydn, which I resisted. It was Beethoven and Mozart and that other guy that they liked, and who set the stage for them to do these better things. Mozart and Haydn were close, and Mozart and Beethoven were not close, but they all knew each other. This particular piece, and there's nothing wrong with the title, but this particular piece does have that sense of hope. And I think we need to remember this isn't just about warfare and what was going on in Haydn's life. It really was about the French Revolution. It was about people not having enough to eat and resisting that. And then when you think about a mass, because so much of that anger and pain in the French Revolution was against the church, all of that kind of adds up in a way that, as an Austrian who spent the last years of his life very, very happily in London, he was a truly sophisticated and cosmopolitan person who got around and saw things. And that really didn't start to happen until we had touring musicians like Liszt and Chopin, who went all over the world, and when travel was easier. I think all of that kind of fits in, even when we think about kind of pop culture references to Mass in Time of War. Probably people listening to this talk may have seen the quite controversial and very, very popular television series Succession. And one of their episodes is called Mass in Time of War, referencing this piece. And of course, it's about this family that's so fraught and crazed about each other and power. But I think it's not a mistake that the producers thought about it that way. And I love those musical kinds of things, being connected. And of course, you and I have spoken about the kind of American background to both what Leonard Bernstein did with the Mass and the Whitman settings. And of course, you can't look at Britten's War Requiem and not realize that he saw the Donnernummers Pacem of Vaughan Williams, not just as another English composer, but the dirge and the two men. And the meeting in the War Requiem. It's a direct anecdotal and comparison kind of thing. And of course, English composing was just digging out from the German influence, and there wanted to be an English sense of what English music was, a very nationalistic thing around that, and that's Elgar and everybody else that came around at that time. But it also led Vaughan Williams to delve into English folk song. And I think one of the things about Donnernummers Pacem that maybe a Latin title belies is that there's a simplicity around all of Vaughan Williams and a pastoral sense. But this is the most in-your-face Verdi Requiem kind of piece, and he resisted the Verdi Requiem, Vaughan Williams did, but then listened to it and looked at the score and realized that every composer has their own voice and does their own thing, and he wanted a bit of that scream and a bit of that pain, more than a bit, in this particular piece, as also is in Lilacs.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned Succession. My sister just texted me and said, "Hey, have you seen the show?"
There you go.
So now it's 2 people, and within 2 days, I got to check it out.
Only do 1 episode at a time. It's a lot to take in.
Is that right?
I mean, it's incredibly well written, but it's not it's not Modern Family by any stretch of the or Leave It to Beaver. It's very not that.
Well, back to Vaughan Williams in a second, but sticking with the Mass in Time of War too. It has to be tough to live in the shadow of Mozart, but I got to tell you, these masses of Haydn are really good. And Mozart, of course, at one point he was working for the church. He was writing masses. He had sort of a acrimonious relationship with his employer.
Well, he didn't like working for anybody, and neither did Beethoven. I mean, that was the whole resistance, right? Haydn didn't have a problem.
Well, he was working for the court, and Mozart is working for the archbishop, and the archbishop is saying, "Hey, don't give me these long, elaborate masses. I just need a nice short one, nice and tidy." And I think Mozart kind of resented that. And those are charming pieces. They're the Missa Brevi of Mozart are really good. But these Haydn masses, I got to say, they really trump those. And you mentioned the American connection, and there's a story about the Mass-and-Time War that you shared with me that occurred.
Well, of course, one of the ways that you and I have connected over the years, long before the thought of working together might be a possibility, was Bernstein's Mass, which is a huge undertaking for any organization to do, and one that I think a lot of us who do undertake it, whether as a producer or an artist, wonders about halfway through, why am I doing this again? This is really difficult to do. What does this piece mean? But I think today, with the Bernstein 100th birthday in 2018 and ever since, people have begun to realize even more than before that Bernstein was way ahead of his time. Haydn was way ahead of his time too. These were difficult pieces to play. We have to remember that the level of orchestral playing and singing was not in 1794 what it is today by any stretch of the imagination. So was he working a little bit to make things simpler? No way. The creation is not simple. Seasons is not simple. And this piece is not simple either. But I think it gets to the idea of where does a work of music, where does a work of art, whether it's Guernica or The Mass-and-Time of War, fit into our lives today? What is the applicability? How does it reach us today? I think that classical music has kind of preciousized itself a lot by putting itself on a pedestal, making it an ivory tower, that these great composers are kind of floating above the real world. Not that case at all. These are real world people. Certainly Mozart, certainly Beethoven, but definitely Haydn as well, and Van Williams. They knew what was going on, right? And if you are trying to create a work that's going to reach people's passions and emotions, you can't help but bring that into the fold, whether you're Leonard Bernstein or Ray Van Williams. And Bernstein was, because he had a pulpit of popularity and charisma and kind of movie star-ish aura, and the Young People's Concerts. We had a TV show when no one did, and it wasn't a Toscanini TV show, concerts, it was talking to you, right? Just like the True Concord singers talk to you in a concert performance, which I think is such a magical thing. He would do that, and he was very good at it too. He wrote all those things. He had 6 script writers for those things, but still, he knew what he was doing when it came to that. So, Bernstein was very much a peacenik, no question about that. And Richard Nixon was not his favorite person. And when Richard Nixon was being inaugurated for the second time, so I guess this would have been 73. There's a concert at the Kennedy Center in celebration of that with the Philadelphia Orchestra, Van Cliburn, Ormandy, 1812 Overture, Grieg Concerto, kind of your straight ahead, still today, a straight ahead kind of whiz-bang popular classical concert. And a mile away at the National Cathedral with a pickup orchestra, Leonard Bernstein is conducting Mass-and-Time of War. And about a week later, the church came out and said, "Oh, this wasn't protest. This wasn't counter anything. This is, he just wanted to do it." And then I guess a little bit later, the Archbishop said, "What do you mean? Of course it was." Eugene McCarthy introduced it. The man of peace as a white person, right in the '60s, and it probably would have been McCarthy and Dr. King had he still been alive at that same time. So not everybody welcomes these kinds of things. There are lots of us, including myself, that just want music to be what I'm going to hear for those 2 hours at 8 o'clock, right? And not have what may seem extraneous or extraterrestrial to the music to invade. But I think we just need to understand context, as you said at the very beginning of this talk. And Bernstein, it's a lot of wink, wink, nudge, nudge, but it was pretty powerful. And 13,000 people were there, 3,000 in the church, 10,000 outside. So Kennedy Center, 2,500 seats, and numbers of people and feet often say what is actually going on. And of course, he had the power, Bernstein did, to do that kind of thing. But it was momentous, no question.
And it just underscores music's power to speak to the moment.
Absolutely. And did all those 13,000 people come because it was the Mass-and-Time of War? I think he may, I don't know this, I think he may have chosen the piece because they didn't know the piece necessarily. The Haydn Renaissance is kind of still happening, right? So it's not like the 1812 Overture, right? Which has war and cannons and all those kinds of things. It's a very different kind of way of going. And a hope. And as much about, for Bernstein in the 70s, Vietnam, as it was about a divided nation, right? times that we're living in right now. And I think we all know that. And it's painful. It's really, really painful. It's painful for all of us. It's painful for kids. And there's COVID. It's just a tricky time. Really difficult.
So the power of music to bring people together, to heal, and to...
Even for a moment.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So let's talk about the Vaughan Williams more, because I think it's a brilliant compilation of texts, and it comes from several different sources. We already mentioned Whitman, of course, and Whitman writing this poetry in the context of the American Civil War, and Vaughan Williams taking those many of those texts and incorporating that into his piece, Dona Nobis Pacem, in which the European nations are facing the rise of Nazism and fascism, but along with
and the casualty number.
Oh yeah,
just staggering.
So we've got these Whitman texts. We have this unifying text of Dona Nobis Pacem, which we've talked about, comes from the Agnus Dei, from the Mass. Grant us peace. This Dona Nobis Pacem finds its way into the piece at many times. It's not just the apotheosis at the end, but it's that persistent message that Vaughan Williams is inserting through this libretto. So the piece opens with this soprano plea, Agnus Dei qui tollis peccata mundi, Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world, have mercy, grant us peace. And from there, after that sets the table, we get the trumpets, we get the drums, beat drums, blow through the windows, through the doors, burst like a ruthless force, and you get the chaotic, sort of frenetic sense of warfare and impending doom, and so it's chaotic and troubling, and then after this picture of a battle, we get sort of the calm after the storm. And here we get more of Whitman's text. Word over all, beautiful as the sky, beautiful that war and all its deeds of carnage must in time be utterly lost. So pointing to a time where we're not in this state of war, this constant threat of conflict, and it's a beautiful picture. That ultimately leads to this. You mentioned this dirge for two veterans. This is really poignant, and I'm reminded actually of Jake Runested's Dreams of the Fallen, in which Jake and Brian Turner, the poet who served in both the Iraq and Afghanistan war, talk about just the horrors of war, and in this dirge, and it really is a dirge. Here we've got the drums become not the drums of war leading the troops, but a funeral dirge for two veterans. And in this case, from the text that we get from Whitman, it's a father and a son. It's tragic that these two go to fight for their country, and they lose their lives. And you get this picture of a funeral and just a reminder of just the horrors of war.
And I think that very personal piece, Vaughan Williams had been losing friends in the war at that same time. And we can never underestimate the power of that. And that's when he decided to become a medic. I've got this photograph of him in an ambulance. It's not something I think we think composers do.
Yeah, right.
They're often in a beautiful study with a piano,
right,
or a sound system. And I don't mean to be silly about it, but again, that real world kind of situation.
He lived it, and that experience comes through
absolutely
in the music. So again, even in this dirge, we get that Dona Nobis Pacem that comes in and is that hopeful reminder that this too shall pass and we can achieve a better world.
Now, do you know, prior to the Vaughan Williams, whether that kind of structure of two people had ever been used before? Obviously in opera, right? Verdi does it all the time, and Wagner too. But in a cantata, I mean, it's very unusual, is it not?
I think so. This piece is
It's unique.
It is unique, and it's part of what draws me to it. You know, it's almost operatic in its libretto and its structure.
It's drama, exactly.
You know, you've got
Story.
Yep. And its fundamental structure. You've got the soprano soloist, you've got the baritone soloist who plays an entirely different role.
Right.
From the soprano. The soprano is sort of the voice from the crowd, you know, making these pleas, and the baritone is almost this angelic figure who's proclaiming hope, and here we get texts now that come from the Old Testament mostly, and some New Testament. We get these words. The glory of this latter house shall be greater than of the former, and in this place will I give peace. And this is really the transitional and transformational moment, because now we turn from the horrors of war and we turn to this vision. And we get more words here. These are biblical as well. Nation shall not lift up a sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. And here we get this wonderful musical picture that starts in real quiet, but builds to this glorious, I mean, really glorious music on the words, you know, glory to God in the highest, and on earth peace, goodwill toward men. Interestingly, also come from the Mass text. And then the piece, after reaching this climax of ecstasy, of this vision of a world without conflict, without war, it ends then quietly returning to those words: grant us peace, dona nobis pacem, now. It's really awesome.
It is awesome. And God knows I don't want to be in any way critical of any other composer, but the easier way out in many ways from a structural and text point of view would have been to write a requiem. Yeah. As Britten does. Britten's writing about World War I poetry, Wilfred Owen, but World War II. And a different experience, right? Because no one thought it would happen again, and there we go, right? Yeah. Talk about divisive and painful socioeconomic things going on, but just the warfare and planes and just how the technology had become so brutal and awful. So again, not being critical of him on the Requiem piece, and of course there is peace at the end of the Requiem, of the War Requiem, but it's 90 minutes before you get there.
Yeah, right.
And it's pretty rough along the way, as it was meant to be. So again, not being critical of that, but that could have been, Vaughan Williams could have written a longer piece. It could have been something that if he had been thinking about posterity and his reputation, he might have written something different. This is a unique work, and it's why it doesn't get programmed as often as it otherwise could. The forces are unusual, the soloists are unusual, it's a Latin title, and based on looking at the title and looking at the forces, you won't really know what it is. I mean, I don't think I knew for a long time that Whitman was in it. You know, it's because it's just something I didn't really look at. I thought maybe it was a piece he wrote, commissioned by a church, and I would listen to it sometime. And it's very, very different, both in terms of what it is intrinsically, but also the effect it had on other composers moving down the line. And his antecedents, because he really did look at the Verdi Requiem and say, oh, it's Italian opera, trashy and cheap and vulgar and things like that, and then went, no, not at all. This is something different completely, as is this work, which is why I think the combination with a real mass is fascinating. Yeah. And I think audiences are going to really be knocked out.
I think so too, and I think that the people will walk away, as we hope, with a sense of hope for future. I mean, when I was conceiving this program months and maybe even a couple of years ago, you know, we were still in the midst of this Afghanistan war. I mean, and this year marks the 20th anniversary of that war. I mean, thankfully it's come to an end, but you know, the atrocities haven't. And this music, I think, powerfully speaks to that, again, this vision that, you know, when all people come together and we respect and honor each other and lift each other up for all that we have in common and not fight and bicker about our differences, we can achieve this vision.
And it's what makes live performance such a unique animal, because we're all there together. We may not know who's sitting next to us, but we're having a communal experience, and it's the music that is washing over us and into our hearts and our brains and pulls us together. I always love watching audiences when they arrive and when they leave.
Yeah.
And you can sense the transformation every time. I did last weekend, and I know I'm going to this time around.
Cool. Well, thanks again, Welz, for joining me on
Thanks
this.
for not making me translate Latin too.
There's only that little bit of Latin
That's
in Vaughan Williams, but great music. Can't wait to share it with all of you, and please join us if you can live with these performances. And yet keep in mind that wherever you are, you have the option of our video presentations, which are available for purchase, and you can enjoy this program and all of our programs this season in the comfort of your own home. So thank you again for joining us, and we wish you all the best.